Welcome to Yin Yoga Lifestyle. I am your host, Colette Darville. Cultivating our body's resilience and inner silence and its application to all aspects of your life. Let's become enlightened and enjoy the power of intuitiveness and creativity. And thank you for joining us today. I am your host, Colette Darville, and this is Yin Yoga Lifestyle. So now let us take a deep meditative breath. Inhale, so. Exhale, hum. EMILLIE PARRISH is the author of the popular website fermentingforfoodies.com, which features healthy recipes designed to feed your microbiome. EMILLIE came to the world of fermenting foods through her family. Her 2 children and her husband were either allergic or intolerant to a huge list of foods. After suffering from a host of autoimmune conditions, eczema, and digestive sensitivities, EMILLIE's family physician suggested that they start eating fermented foods. And EMILLIE and her family began the journey into the world of fermented foods. EMILLIE draws on her background in science, healthcare, and creativity to write well-informed articles about the importance of gut health for immunity and general well-being. In addition to living a healthy lifestyle, EMILLIE is lucky enough to live and work on an island in the Pacific Northwest with her husband and their 2 children. Welcome to Yin Yoga Lifestyle, EMILLIE.
Thanks for having me.
And to begin with, I want to know, how's the weather on the West Coast on your island?
It's actually clearing up and pretty nice. We've had a lot of good weather. Yeah.
Oh, sounds lovely.
Yeah.
Sounds lovely. I guess fall is going to be coming into the picture soon, right?
Yeah, it's just starting here. Yeah.
So that means you're going to be having lots of nice warm food. And tell me, how were you introduced to fermented foods?
Well, you did a really good job of explaining that in the introduction. It was my family doctor. I personally had my appendix out, like ruptured, when I was in my early 20s, and I was on a huge cocktail of antibiotics in the hospital. When they discharged me from the hospital, they actually gave me this note that said, avoid going out in the sun. Like that's how badly my microbiome was depleted.
Oh.
They were warning me that I couldn't even go out in the sun because I would burn more easily. And then 10 years later, I had my children, and both of them had different food intolerances and allergies, and I was having a lot of my own digestive issues, and I was sitting in my GP's office, and my daughter at 15 months couldn't eat eggs, couldn't do gluten, couldn't do coconut products. My son was allergic to sulfites. He was sensitive to sugar. Sulfites was really hard. He had really, really bad eczema, and I was just like, I don't even know how to feed them. Like, the sulfite food list is actually really small. Most canned goods contain sulfites. It doesn't even have to be labeled. Like, the allergist was great. She'd given me a list of where I could buy food for him and what I could buy. Like, there was 1 can of tomatoes that I could buy at a single store in town. And I was just like, I can't do it. I can't do the gluten-free, no eggs, like no sulfites. And she's like, you know what? You need to look at doing some probiotic work. And I was like, well, we've been taking probiotics. But she said, you know what? You really should try fermenting. And I'll admit, she's an osteopathic GP, which is still like a physician. She's actually trained in the US, and in the US it's like a general practitioner, but you get more of a holistic approach as well. Anyways, so that's where she came from with it.
Wow.
And so I started fermenting, and I discovered that there really wasn't a lot of good information about it. There was the Wild Food Bible from Sander Katz, I think is his name. And but it's not very prescriptive, and it's more just like leave stuff out and it will ferment, and I didn't know what to do. And I really so I started the blog, and in the beginning it was really me exploring and experimenting. And then maybe a few years later, fermenting became more popular and my blog was becoming popular, and I realized I actually needed to do a better job with my content. So
Mm.
I've been slowly fixing older posts so that they're a little bit more precise and with better photography than mine.
Wow, that's quite the
Yeah.
journey, though. That's quite the journey.
Yeah.
I can't imagine having a family and not knowing what to feed them. That would be crazy. And but you persevered. Now, can you tell us explain the difference between fermenting and pickled foods?
Well, I would say fermentation is a form, like fermenting vegetables is a form of pickling. Fermenting is a huge variety of things. It can be, making miso with mold or making sourdough bread with a wild yeast. But in terms of pickling, I think what you're talking about is pickling vegetables with vinegar.
Yes.
And so that's the acidity that protects those vegetables. And fermenting uses the same sort of process. If you're fermenting vegetables, the lactic bacteria acidify the vegetables and protect it that way. They both outcompete the pathogen, like the
Mm.
bad bacteria that might cause it to rot, as well as acidify it and protect the vegetables that way. Yeah, it's very
Ah.
similar.
That's very interesting. Now we hear more and more that our overall health, and our immune system, can be vastly improved by having and maintaining a healthy gut, which you've just talked about. But the fermented foods, I've heard they give your skin beautiful, healthy glow, and that it helps reduce the digestive problems and stress, and that it also helps to improve your mood and dealing with sleep issues. That's a lot of things to put on fermented foods. Is it true?
Um, yes.
Ah,
So I'm not about to make any specific claims, but basically, there are more our microbiome actually comprises more cells than there are human cells in our body. Our microbiome coats every surface in our body, both like in our intestinal system, in our lungs, all over our skin. It is our first line of defense of our immune system, and it affects how we digest foods. And as I mentioned with my appendicitis experience, it also protects our skin from sun damage and eczema. And they're really, it's like a huge area of interest and research right now as to how the microbiome plays a role in our health and well-being. And it affects everything from, if you're a sweet tooth, it's because the gut bacteria in your gut are used to eating sugars, and so they crave sugars, and they give you the information to want to crave sugars too.
mm,
It affects our ability. There's a lot of evidence that it affects our ability to lose weight. So people who struggle on diets and just aren't really succeeding, often it's just rebalancing your gut bacteria to have the right flora to allow you to lose weight. Dental health also has a huge role, like your microbiome has a huge role in your cavities and dental
mm.
health. Like it's unbelievable how fundamental it is, and how it is definitely something that is hugely of interest now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really, and a lot of people don't realize that the importance of keeping a healthy gut, do they?
No.
No. And on your website, fermentingforfoodies.com, you address this by recommending we follow the microbiome diet. Can you go into a little bit more, um, explain what having a healthy gut actually means and what this sort of microbiome diet actually entails?
Okay, so there are a few people who have written about microbiome diets, and they all
Mm.
have their specific recommendations. Like, I think one person says no dairy. I actually have a background in neuroscience, and I worked in a hospital
Mm-hmm.
with patients. So I really went from like a very science-based approach to it, mostly starting for myself and then obviously sharing with others. So because our microbiome is such a big part of who we are, trying to create the right balances of bacteria and yeast and various strains that we have also influences how I'm trying to think, like how healthy we are. So you
Right.
need to feed your microbiome to create the right strains. In fact, changes in
Right.
diet, it only takes about 2 weeks to start changing your microbiome. It's pretty quick in responding to what you eat. So the best way to feed your microbiome, as probably maybe a few of your listeners have already heard about, is taking probiotics, and
Yes.
I recommend fermented foods,
Yeah.
and eating prebiotic food. So this is stuff that isn't digested by you. It gets to your intestines undigested, and that's what your gut bacteria get to feed on.
Mm.
So
And
fibers, like high fiber food and resistant starches. So vegetables and fruits, like with the skin, like fruits with the skin on and stuff, that's all great sources of fiber if you're not into eating grains. But whole grains or resistant starches are often found in cooked and cooled bread, which is why sometimes breads in stores are like, we're prebiotic. And that's because when you cook and then you cool a grain, the starches in it become more resistant. And so then they aren't as quickly digested, especially if they're whole grains. Um,
wow.
and then my last recommendation is to avoid sugars, even low glycemic sweeteners.
Mm.
And that's hard because we're all so used to eating it, and it's such a part of our culture. Um, However, like sugar feeds the wrong kinds of bacteria and yeasts in our body. And if you're eating low glycemic sugars, often they're high fructose, which isn't absorbed by our bodies, but it goes right to the intestines and also feeds the wrong
Wow.
bacteria. Or other alternative sugars are like high alcohol sugars, and those are hard on your digestive system as well. So yeah, I recommend
That's
fruit
that
sugars.
that's yeah, and and a lot of alternative medicine practitioners say, hey, look, stay away from sugar. A lot of the and but we still consume it, and it can come in fruit and honey and all those things, right?
Well, fruit sugars, I mean, I guess if you ate a ton of fruit, you'd be getting a lot of sugar.
Right.
But the way I liken it is if you're drinking like a glass of juice, that's like 5 or 6 pieces of fruit in that glass of juice. But if you eat the apple, you're eating the fiber in the skin. It takes you a lot more work. And so an apple is a great way to get your sweet for the day, or a strawberry, or
Yeah. Yeah.
um, yeah, but yeah, fruit juice sugars are typically higher in sugar, lower in fiber, or
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, that brings me to my next question. What percentage of our diets do you recommend should be fermented foods?
So I don't think it's a percentage as much as I would recommend trying to eat something fermented every day.
Hmm.
Um, and I also recommend trying a diversity of fermented foods. So when we were first starting on our fermentation journey, I went out to try a bunch of different things, and I came up with a few fermented foods that were actually really hard for us to digest. And that's because they contained the cultures that we didn't actually have in our bodies. So we just slowly were eating them and introducing them until we were able to tolerate those fermented foods. So it's all about trying to get a good diversity.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah, that I get that's simple to do, isn't it?
Uh, Simple in quotations. Like, I guess if you made it your project, but I mean, it's
Right.
pretty easy to try. If you're into buying yogurt, try buying a few different types of yogurt. They all have slightly different, combinations
Yeah.
of bacterial strains. So, yeah.
Um, so, you talked about prebiotics and probiotics in a previous answer. But once we've started adding fermented foods into our diets on a regular basis, are we getting enough pre and probiotics from eating these fermented foods, or do we still need to take a probiotic supplement?
Okay, so I'm not a huge fan of supplements that come in the shape of a pill.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
uh, there's not a lot of research to support that they are effective. In fact, I think there was this British study a few years ago that looked at 8 different probiotic supplements, and none of them survived the digestive system.